What happens when history's most evil regime is also catastrophically stupid? This isn't a story of masterminds, it's a highlight reel of blunders, backfires, and bureaucratic breakdowns so absurd they make satire look subtle. From meth-fueled air marshals to occult-obsessed chicken farmers, these are the 53 Nazis who weren't just evil, they were dumb by nature. And as the Reich crumbled, it wasn't just justice closing in, it was gravity. Welcome to the collapse of a regime that couldn't stop sabotaging itself. Because sometimes the villain doesn't need a hero to lose, just his own stupidity. Before we dive headfirst into this parade of catastrophic failure, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, where history isn't just dark, it's dumbfounding. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment of beautifully documented disaster. And hey, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location and the time in the comments. Midnight in Berlin? Lunch break in Texas? Can't sleep in Manila? Let's see how far stupidity travels. 1. Adolf Hitler. He fancied himself a genius of war, yet refused to listen to actual generals. Hitler micromanaged battles from hundreds of miles away, overruled tactical retreats, and planned invasions using vibes and astrology. He delayed Operation Barbarossa by invading Greece, just in time for the Russian winter to crush his dreams. His greatest enemy wasn't Stalin, it was logistics, but he never learned. In the end, his vision led Germany straight into a self-made meat grinder, while he clung to maps like they were lottery tickets. Turns out the only thing worse than a dictator is one who thinks he's Napoleon. 2. Hermann Göring. He wore velvet uniforms, stuffed himself with stolen art, and promised Hitler air supremacy at Stalingrad, without checking if his planes could actually fly in snow. His Luftwaffe collapsed under his bloated ego and meth-clouded optimism. He declared he'd drop supplies by air to a trapped Sixth Army. He dropped starvation. When Berlin burned, Göring fled like a peacock without feathers, still insisting he was in control. He even tried to declare himself Hitler's successor. Hitler responded by ordering his arrest. If power corrupts, Göring proved it also bloats, deludes, and crashes into the Volga. And that was Hermann Göring. Proof that confidence without competence can crash harder than any Luftwaffe mission he ever planned. If you're still here marveling at the madness, don't forget to subscribe for more history that's stranger and dumber than fiction. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next beautifully avoidable disaster. Also, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. This channel runs on global insomnia and questionable life choices. 3. Heinrich Himmler. A chicken farmer turned occult bureaucrat, Himmler believed in magic stones, Nordic ancestors, and negotiating with the British. In 1945. He ran the SS like a spiritual cult, then tried to flip sides as if World War II was a bad Tinder date. After decades of brutal loyalty, he thought the Allies might forgive genocide if he offered them a handshake. Hitler found out and exploded. The Allies shrugged. And Himmler? A man who thought discipline was everything died proving he had none. But if you think that's delusional, wait until you meet the guy who flew to Scotland alone. 4. Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels was the minister of propaganda, but his biggest fiction was his belief in his own genius. He spent years shaping Hitler's image while ignoring reality entirely. By the time he called for total war, Berlin was already surrounded. His speeches thundered with fury, but the Reich's factories were crumbling, and the only thing multiplying was despair. He built illusions while the ground disappeared beneath him, convinced that words could still win wars. And yet, somehow, even Goebbels looked sane compared to the guy who flapped his way into Scotland with a peace plan and zero coordination. 5. Rudolf Hess. He climbed into a plane in 1941, alone, and flew to Scotland to negotiate peace with the British, without telling Hitler, the Luftwaffe, or literally anyone with a map. He believed he could single-handedly end World War II through vibes and aristocratic charm. He crash-landed, was arrested, and the British assumed it was a Nazi plot so stupid it had to be fake. Back in Germany, Hitler called him mentally unstable and deleted him from the narrative. But don't worry, Hitler found another yes-man who confidently assured him Britain would never intervene. Spoiler, they did. 6. Joachim von Ribbentrop. A failed champagne salesman turned foreign minister, Ribbentrop had a gift for saying the exact wrong thing at the worst possible time. He promised Hitler that Britain would never go to war over Poland. Hours later, they did. His treaties were disasters in formalware, and his diplomatic instincts were so bad even fellow Nazis rolled their eyes. He once tried to lecture Churchill about honor. It went about as well as you'd expect. And speaking of things going off the rails, wait until you meet the Nazi economist who treated war like a Ponzi scheme. 7. Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht styled himself as the financial wizard of the Reich, but his creative accounting was basically a stack of IOUs glued together with confidence. He hid debt behind more debt, then acted shocked when the economy behaved like a collapsing card table. His schemes bought time, not stability, and by the time the bills came due, Germany was marching straight into ruin. He insisted everything was under control, right up until it wasn't. And if Schacht built the financial maze, the next guy tried to solve defeat by promising magic weapons like discount alchemy. 8. Albert Speer. Speer sold himself as the good technocrat, a modernist genius who could turn rubble into rockets. In reality, he overpromised miracle weapons that couldn't change the war's outcome and poured resources into prestige projects while cities crumbled. He told Hitler salvation was only one supergun away, as if physics cared about propaganda. His grand plans looked sleek on paper, disastrous in practice. Efficiency meant organized collapse. But even Speer's shiny illusions looked tame compared to the man who controlled Hitler's inbox and used it to sabotage everyone around him. 9. Martin Bormann. Bormann was the shadow operator, the man who controlled access to Hitler like a jealous bouncer. He buried memos, rewrote decisions, and fueled chaos by pitting rivals against each other. His talent wasn't strategy, it was creating confusion so thick even Hitler struggled to navigate it. Policies contradicted each other daily, but Bormann liked it that way. Disorder kept him powerful. Unfortunately for the Reich, it also kept everything else broken. And the next official turned that administrative chaos into full-blown legal anarchy. 10. Wilhelm Frick. Frick tried to build a legal empire but mostly produced a bureaucratic funhouse where rules contradicted each other before lunch. He introduced laws faster than anyone could read them, turning governance into a maze with no exits. Corruption flourished, departments overlapped, and nobody knew who was actually in charge. His order was so chaotic that even Nazi officials complained they couldn't keep track of what was illegal anymore. And if Frick drowned the regime in paperwork, the next man managed to drown himself in something far more fermented. 11. Robert Ley ran the German labor front like a personal playground, fueled by arrogance and a love of excess. Under his direction, resources vanished, records blurred, and dysfunction thrived. His management style was a mix of bluster and denial, wrapped in overconfidence. He claimed everything was improving while factories struggled and workers grumbled. His department became a monument to mismanagement. But Ley's chaos was nothing compared to the official who rubber-stamped every contradictory order that crossed his desk. 12. Hans Lammers. Lammers treated governance like a stamp-collecting hobby. If someone handed him a decree, no matter how conflicting, he approved it. This created an administrative landscape where multiple versions of reality operated at once, and nobody knew which orders were real. Instead of coordinating leadership, he accidentally turned the Reich Chancellery into a bottleneck of confusion. His passivity amplified every crisis. 13. Karl Dönitz. Dönitz believed U-boats could still win the war, long after Allied sonar, depth charges, and code breakers turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. He kept deploying submarines into missions that had gone from risky to suicidal, insisting victory was just one breakthrough away. When he briefly succeeded Hitler, his leadership lasted about as long as his strategies did at sea. His loyalty to failure was absolute. But while Donitz sank ships, the next guy sank the economy and called it strategy. 14. Walter Funk. As economy minister, Funk was supposed to manage wartime finances. Instead, he inflated the currency, misallocated resources, and sat helpless as the economy spiraled. He had no real plan, just blind optimism and vague promises. Industrial production became erratic, price controls failed, and his solutions often made things worse. Funk talked like a technocrat but operated like a gambler on his last chips. Still, even Funk's economic collapse feels organized compared to the general who signed every disastrous order like he was stamping a loyalty card. 15. Wilhelm Keitel. Keitel was so obedient, other generals called him Lackeitel, a pun meaning lackey. His talent wasn't strategy, it was saying yes to whatever Hitler demanded, no matter how irrational. He approved invasions that couldn't be supplied and crackdowns that fueled resistance. Instead of leading, he nodded. When someone needed a scapegoat for a terrible plan, Keitel was always nearby with a pen. And if Keitel was the signature, the next man was the spreadsheet. Equally confident, equally wrong. And that confusion only worsened when the next admiral kept sending submarines into situations everyone knew were hopeless. 16. Alfred Jodl. Jodl's maps always looked great, until reality intervened. As chief of operations, he signed off on timetables that ignored terrain, weather, and basic physics. He treated war like a scheduling problem, convinced troops could march faster than bullets. When plans failed, he doubled down. His blind trust in Hitler's intuition turned coordination into chaos, yet he kept approving disasters like it was paperwork. And if Jodl was the war planner who forgot about mud, the next man was the prophet who helped pave the road to it. 17. Erich Ludendorff. Long before World War II, Ludendorff helped build the myth that Germany didn't lose WBY. It was betrayed. That lie became gospel for the Nazis. He later backed Hitler's early coup attempt, then disowned him like a bad stock pick. Ludendorff believed in total war, but had zero political instincts. He blamed everything on mystical conspiracies and once claimed Christianity weakened Germany. Even his fellow authoritarians cringed, but for sheer battlefield delusion, even Ludendorff had nothing on the general who kept proposing fantasy counterattacks as the front collapsed. 18. Erich von Manstein. Manstein was hailed as a tactical genius, but by 1944, he was drawing counterattack plans that required armies he didn't have and time that no longer existed. He proposed elegant maneuvers on paper while the Eastern Front burned in real time. His solutions were often brilliant in theory and completely useless in practice. He blamed failures on others, never the fact that he was strategizing in a vacuum. And when the theories ran out, the next general leaned into brutality, hoping severity could replace sense. 19. Walter von Reichenau. Reichenau thought terror would win hearts and minds. His infamous severity order demanded brutal crackdowns, believing fear was more efficient than strategy. Instead, it backfired. Badly. Resistance movements grew stronger, fueled by outrage, and his own troops grew demoralized from the chaos he unleashed. He mistook cruelty for control, and in doing so made occupation harder, bloodier, and more self-defeating. His orders didn't secure territory, they incinerated it. But if Reichenau thought holding Stalingrad was a matter of willpower, the next commander mistook loyalty for logic and paid the full price. 20. Friedrich Paulus. Paulus was sent to capture Stalingrad but wound up trapped in it, encircled by Soviet forces and begging for permission to break out. Hitler said no, so Paulus waited. Supplies ran out, reinforcements never came, and surrender became inevitable. Yet he refused to act without orders, clinging to hierarchy over survival. Promoted to field marshal hours before capture, he became the first German officer of that rank to surrender. Even his promotion was a trap. And if Paulus collapsed under pressure, the next field marshal wavered so often, it was hard to tell which side he was on. 21. Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt was a career officer who looked the part but couldn't decide what that part was. One week he supported retreat, the next he ordered counterattacks that made no sense. He'd resign, get reinstated, then contradict himself again. His strategy on the Western Front was a pendulum of doubt. He criticized Hitler's decisions, then enforced them anyway. The only thing consistent was his inconsistency. But while Rundstedt waffled, the next general tried to talk peace behind Hitler's back, right before everything exploded. 22. Günther von Kluge. Kluge had a talent for second-guessing himself at precisely the wrong time. While commanding in France, he quietly explored peace talks with the Allies, just as the Gestapo turned up the heat on internal dissent. Caught between loyalty and survival, he froze, stalled, and accomplished nothing. His attempts at diplomacy came too late to matter and too early to be forgiven. His name became synonymous with hesitation, a man who saw the cliff's edge and couldn't decide whether to stop or jump. And the next man? He failed so often Hitler still rehired him, like clockwork. 23. Ernst Busch. Busch was the military equivalent of a bad investment, constantly underperforming, constantly reappointed. Every time he was put in charge, disaster followed. From the Eastern Front to the Ardennes, he oversaw defeats with a kind of grim enthusiasm, convinced that obedience alone would turn the tide. Even after repeated collapses, Hitler kept giving him new commands, perhaps out of habit. Busch didn't adapt, he repeated. But while Busch kept failing upward, the next officer failed sideways, by partying his way out of Berlin. 24. Hermann Fegelein. Fegelein was less a soldier and more a social climber in uniform. Married into Hitler's inner circle, he treated the war like an inconvenience between parties. When Berlin was under siege, he was caught trying to escape, disguised, drunk, and dressed for a night out. He read the room wrong by several kilometers. His charm couldn't save him when it counted, and his exit was as chaotic as his career. And yet somehow, the next commander thought launching a major offensive without fuel would go better. 25. Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich was loyal, loud, and logistically blind. He led elite SS divisions with the subtlety of a battering ram. But in the Ardennes offensive, he ignored one key detail: fuel. His tanks stalled before the battle really began, turning a surprise attack into a traffic jam in the snow. When questioned, he blamed everyone else: weather, maps, even the terrain. But no excuse could refuel a panzer. Dietrich wanted glory but forgot about gasoline. And if Dietrich couldn't plan a drive through Belgium, the next man couldn't even cover up a conspiracy without fumbling the whole thing. 26. Friedrich Fromm. Fromm was the master of self-preservation, until he wasn't. When the July 20th plot to remove Hitler failed, Fromm panicked. To hide his own complicity, he rushed to execute the conspirators without a trial, hoping it would erase suspicion. It didn't. The Nazis saw through the cleanup job and sidelined him immediately. In trying to save himself, Fromm confirmed exactly what he feared others would suspect. His loyalty was for sale, but no one was buying. The next officer, by contrast, specialized in daring missions, with results that ranged from cinematic to pointless. 27. Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny made a name for himself rescuing Mussolini and pitching sabotage missions with Hollywood flair. But behind the theatrics, his operations often lacked substance. His Ardennes infiltration plan disguised Germans in Allied uniforms. It confused everyone, including his own side. Most of his plots ended in chaos or fizzled before launch. He was more myth than method, thriving on dramatic press rather than strategic outcomes. Still, even Scorzini's overreach feels grounded compared to the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, who tried to build an air force that only existed on paper. 28. Hans Jeschonek. Jeschonek was supposed to keep the Luftwaffe airborne. Instead, he grounded it with fantasy-level production targets and aircraft designs that barely worked. He approved bomber programs that couldn't deliver bombs and insisted Germany could fight a multi-front war with half the planes it needed. His loyalty to Göring's delusions turned air superiority into air confusion. Every time reality pushed back, he doubled down on impossible numbers. And while Jeschonek wrecked the skies, the next official tried to control entire nations through terror, and sparked revolts instead. 29. Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich believed terror was a shortcut to control. In Prague, he crushed dissent so brutally it united his enemies. His policies backfired, inspiring resistance where there had been hesitation. His iron grip squeezed until the whole system cracked. Even Nazis feared him, but not because he was wise. He played the long game with short-sighted brutality, turning order into chaos in record time. His legend was one of fear, but not foresight. And replacing a man feared by everyone? Naturally, they picked someone obsessed with power, but with none of the competence. 30. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Kaltenbrunner inherited Heydrich's job, but not his effectiveness. He barked orders, craved influence, and got tangled in bureaucratic turf wars that made everything worse. He lacked subtlety and saw conspiracies in every corner, chasing shadows while missing the actual threats. His leadership turned fear into farce, and the system he ran buckled under its own weight. He wasn't ruthless so much as reckless, with a touch of paranoia for flair. The next guy? He made mass murder so disorganized that even the Nazis called it a financial disaster. 31. Odilo Globoknik. Globoknik was handed one of the regime's deadliest operations and turned it into a chaos-fueled black hole of corruption. As head of Operation Reinhard, he lost track of money, materials, even personnel, all while siphoning off stolen assets for personal gain. His methods were so sloppy that the SS had to audit him, and the audit found so much theft it was almost impressive. He didn't just brutalize, he mismanaged. And if Globoknik's incompetence came with greed, the next man handed rifles to volunteers who didn't know which end was which. 32. Gottlob Berger. Berger dreamed of a vast SS empire and got it, by recruiting anyone willing to wear a uniform, regardless of training, loyalty, or logic. Under his watch, the SS ballooned into a dysfunctional mess of foreign volunteers who barely spoke German and couldn't hold a line. His divisions crumbled in combat, often retreating before battle began. Quantity replaced quality, and the results spoke for themselves. In several languages, all saying, "This was a bad idea." And while Berger was busy building an army of confusion, the next man was running death squads by day and plotting betrayal by night. 33. Arthur Nebe. Nebe lived in two worlds, one as a bureaucratic killer leading Einsatzgruppen operations, and another as a secret conspirator in anti-Hitler circles. He thought he could walk both paths, executing orders while quietly networking with plotters. But straddling extremes made him sloppy. His role in the July 20th plot was haphazard, his loyalties unreadable, and when things collapsed, so did his web of lies. His idea of strategy was hedging bets until all sides turned on him. The next man didn't hide his incompetence. He made it national policy. 34. Emil Hacha. Hacha wasn't a Nazi by origin, but he played their puppet in occupied Czechoslovakia with such passivity it became destructive. Appointed as a figurehead, he rubber-stamped German demands while his administration slid into dysfunction. His leadership style was best described as present but absent. enabling chaotic policies and deepening the collapse of Czech governance. Even the Nazis grew frustrated with how little he controlled. But Hoxha's quiet failure pales in comparison to the next man, whose incompetence ran concentration camps like mismanaged warehouses of suffering and disease. 35. Richard Glucks oversaw the concentration camp system and couldn't even keep it functioning on its own cruel terms. Disease ran rampant, supply chains broke down, and his management failures led to thousands of deaths that even the regime considered wasteful. His fixation on quotas clashed with his inability to enforce basic logistics. He wasn't just brutal, he was inefficient too. Glucks turned industrialized horror into administrative collapse. Yet somehow the next man taught his division to replace structure with rage, and called that discipline. 36. Theodor Eicke. Eicke shaped the SS Totenkopf division in his own image, violent, unpredictable, and barely controlled. He treated brutality as a shortcut to morale and gutted the concept of discipline in favor of intimidation. His troops operated less like a military unit and more like a mob with uniforms. In battle, they were reckless. In occupation, they were worse. Eicke believed chaos was loyalty, and when chaos wasn't enough, the next official added corruption so excessive, even his fellow Nazis told him to stop. 37. Friedrich Jeckeln. Jeckeln ran occupied territories with such reckless brutality and corruption that even other Nazis were horrified. His operations were so disorganized, so overflowing with theft, sadism, and waste, that the SS eventually removed him, not out of morality, but because he was bad for business. Jeckeln didn't just abuse power, he set fire to efficiency, strategy, and long-term control in the process. His rule made enemies faster than he could count. But for raw instability, Jeckeln still couldn't match the next thug-turned official, whose rise ended with a bullet from his own regime. 38. Gauleiter. Ernst Röhm. Röhm helped build the Nazi Party's paramilitary muscle, but then inflated it into an uncontrollable mess. His SA grew so massive and undisciplined that even Hitler saw it as a threat. Röhm demanded a merger with the army and styled himself as a revolutionary within a revolution. It backfired. His ambition exceeded his usefulness, and the regime responded the way authoritarian regimes always do, with a purge. Röhm was too loud, too bold, and too wrong about his importance. Meanwhile, the next man ran a newspaper so vile that his fellow Nazis wanted him canceled before canceling was a thing. 39. Julius Streicher. Streicher's role was propaganda, but his publication. Der Stürmer was so hysterically hateful and grotesquely absurd that it became an embarrassment to the regime. Even hardened Nazis found his rhetoric cartoonish. He wasn't clever, just loud, obsessive, and incapable of coherent strategy. He was removed from power not for ethics, but because he was a PR liability. Streicher turned propaganda into parody, ranting himself into irrelevance. And while he raged on paper, the next official turned an entire country into a failed experiment in rule by repression. 40. Hans Frank. As Governor General of occupied Poland, Hans Frank ruled with a mix of theatrical cruelty and administrative chaos. He fancied himself a cultured intellectual while overseeing atrocities and logistical collapse. His policies sparked fierce partisan resistance, and his inability to control corruption within his own administration turned Poland into a mess even by Nazi standards. He gave speeches about law and order while presiding over anarchy. But if Frank broke Poland through misrule, the next Gauleiter tried to Germanize entire populations with a plan so confused it canceled itself out. 41. Albert Forster. Forster was put in charge of Germanizing Poland's West Prussia region and promptly turned it into a bureaucratic disaster. His racial classification policies changed weekly, resulting in contradictory orders that left even SS officials baffled. Some locals were Germanized, others deported, then some were re-Germanized, all depending on who filled out the forms. His plan had no consistency, and the ideological purity he claimed to enforce was buried in paperwork and favoritism. Still, Forster's chaos looked mild next to the brutality of the man who tried to rule Ukraine with an iron fist, and triggered an uprising instead. 42. Erich Koch. Koch treated Ukraine like his personal empire, ruling with cruelty so severe it united nationalists, peasants, and even former collaborators against him. He saw locals as subhuman labor and enforced policies so violent and exploitative that entire regions became ungovernable. Resistance surged under his watch, not despite his rule, but because of it. He crushed loyalty with arrogance and turned a potential asset into a battlefield. And when the Nazis finally started retreating, the next administrator's big idea was to sabotage everything, including his own credibility. 43. Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Seyss-Inquart's main contribution during the German retreat from the Netherlands was to destroy as much infrastructure as possible: bridges, ports, railways, crippling the country long after the war ended. His obsession with scorched earth tactics didn't slow the Allies. It just deepened civilian suffering and economic collapse. Even other Nazis questioned the point of his sabotage. He wasn't delaying defeat. He was accelerating dysfunction. But while Seyss-Inquart broke bridges, the next Nazi was busy breaking youth programs through sheer mismanagement. 44. Baldur von Schirach. Von Schirach led the Hitler Youth, but instead of producing a unified generation of ideologues, he delivered a logistical nightmare. Supplies disappeared, training was inconsistent, and his organizational plans were so disjointed that entire regions had no functioning leadership. He promised strength and order, then delivered paper shortages and food complaints. His version of future leadership looked more like a failed summer camp with armbands. And if von Schirach botched indoctrination, the next man corrupted Nazi politics from the inside, like a gangster in a tailored uniform. 45. Christian Weber. Weber was a former bouncer turned Nazi enforcer who used his connections to amass wealth, power, and enemies in equal measure. Installed in Munich, he turned the city into his personal kingdom of bribes, extortion, and petty rivalries. Even senior Nazis were embarrassed by how openly corrupt he was. His antics didn't just undermine the regime's image, they turned local governance into a backroom circus. But Weber's localized chaos was nothing compared to the next official who managed to turn Belarus into one giant resistance movement. 46. Wilhelm Kube. Kube oversaw Nazi rule in Belarus, where his heavy-handed brutality didn't crush opposition, it multiplied it. His scorched earth policies and indiscriminate violence made collaboration impossible and turned the countryside into a hotbed of partisan warfare. He couldn't tell the difference between control and chaos, so he created both. Even fellow Nazis viewed his tactics as strategically counterproductive. Kube ruled by fear and was shocked when fear ruled back. But while Kube burned Belarus, the next fanatic was too busy defending a doomed city like it was Rome itself. 47. Karl Hanke. Appointed Gauleiter of Breslau in the final months of the war, Hanke ordered a last-stand defense that turned the city into rubble. Civilians were drafted, supplies ran out, and surrender was forbidden, even when defeat was obvious. Hanke's orders weren't just stubborn, they were theatrical. He wanted to be seen as the last man standing, even if the city stood no more. When the fall finally came, he vanished. And if Hanke was the architect of pointless last stands, the next official tried to make all of Norway collapse, with him in it. 48. Joseph Terboven. Terboven ruled Norway like a villain in a bad opera, grandiose, erratic, and out of touch. As the Allies closed in, he proposed blowing up everything: ports, cities, entire regions. His scorched earth fantasies were so excessive, even Nazi command told him to stop. He turned occupation into obsession, believing destruction was a form of victory. When denied his finale, he spiraled into irrelevance. Yet for all his delusions of grandeur, the next official kept things simple. He just made every single problem worse. 49. Paul Giesler. Giesler was a textbook case of promotion through rage. As Gauleiter of Munich near the war's end, he responded to the collapsing front by lashing out, ordering executions, purges, and crackdowns with no tactical purpose. His version of defense involved massacres that only destabilized the region further. He didn't lead, he lashed out. Giesler viewed retreat as treason and loyalty as license to destroy. His reign created fear, not coordination, and turned Munich into a pressure cooker with no release valve. The more the situation crumbled, the harder he pressed down on it. But if Giesler failed by doubling down on violence, the next man failed by betting everything on a wall of concrete, and promises he could never keep. 50. Fritz Todt. Todt was hailed as the Reich's master builder, but his real specialty was overpromising. The Atlantic Wall? Impressive in theory, mostly decorative in practice. His timelines were fantasy, his budgets vanished into thin air, and his logistics often collapsed under their own weight. Todt treated military engineering like stage design, grand illusions with no structural integrity. Behind the glossy propaganda shots, bunkers remained incomplete, supplies fell short, and defenses were riddled with gaps. His greatest monuments to Nazi might were mostly facades, expensive, delayed, and strategically hollow. And yet, even Todt's projects seemed almost practical next to the rocket man who preferred prestige over purpose. 51. Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was a gifted engineer who prioritized headlines over battlefield results. His V-2 rocket was a technical marvel, fast, expensive, and wildly inefficient. It burned more resources than it damaged enemy infrastructure and had no effect on the war's outcome. But to von Braun, that didn't matter. What mattered was the spectacle. He sold the V-2 as a wonder weapon while quietly admitting it was mostly a symbolic terror tool. Strategic impact? Minimal. Scientific ego? Maximum. He wasn't building victory. He was building a resume. Still, for all von Braun's ambition, the next scientist went even further off the rails, into biology, bad science, and total failure. 52. Kurt Blohm. Blohm fancied himself the future of biological warfare, except his research produced more fantasy than function. Obsessed with weaponizing disease, he poured resources into projects with no viable outcome, chasing apocalyptic ideas with medieval methods. He spoke confidently of plagues that never came, and viruses he never isolated. His experiments were scattered, poorly documented, and scientifically unsound, often overlapping with other programs in a tangle of bureaucratic nonsense. In the end, he promised the Reich bioweapons that never left the lab, if they ever existed at all. Blohm didn't just fail at ethics, he failed at results. And yet, the crown jewel of failed Nazi science belongs to the next man, who tried to manage all miracle weapons at once, and mastered the art of promising everything while delivering chaos. 53. Hans Kammler. Kammler was given control over Nazi Wunderwaffe projects, jet aircraft, rockets, secret bases, and promptly buried them under dysfunction. He jumped between programs, made sweeping declarations, and reorganized everything constantly, leaving engineers scrambling and timelines disintegrating. His management style was paranoia wrapped in ambition, hoard power, move facilities, then deny responsibility when deadlines vanished. Instead of delivering game-changing technology, he delivered missed targets and infighting. The V-2, jet fighter, and underground factories all faltered under his chaos. Kammler promised Hitler the future, and accidentally helped guarantee defeat. But the real mystery isn't how he failed, it's how he disappeared, and why no one ever found him.